It's a pleasure to be in front of you this morning, or this afternoon, to welcome Susan Avery, who is the president and director of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, as the speaker for today's colloquium. I also want to thank everybody who is not resident in Building 401 for braving the still slippery and snowy conditions out there. So it's actually nice to see a lot of faces in the audience today. So Susan's research activities include atmospheric dynamics, precipitation, and radar observing systems. And I think it's probably fair to say that she's an atmospheric scientist who's working on oceanographic problems. So in today's talk, she'll tell us about the challenges and potential benefits that can come from using new and transformative technologies to study the interaction between specifically the ocean and the rest of the Earth systems. As an atmospheric scientist, she has addressed a multitude of national and international forums, including giving the TEDx Boston lecture and speaking in front of several congressional committees, mainly to convey the importance and to try and convey an understanding of the Earth as a system containing oceans, atmosphere, terrestrial, and human interactions. And we're really quite fortunate to have her to give us an introduction to these topics today. Susan has served on numerous boards. She has a long list of distinguished accolades and awards, which I will not go through this morning. And she's really been operating at the highest levels for a number of years in a number of different positions, including having been one of two U.S. representatives to the United Nations Scientific Advisory Board to provide guidance about science, technology, and innovation for sustainable development. Also, she's almost a local. Her PhD is from University of Illinois, and she's also a past director for the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences at the University of Colorado Boulder. So today she'll give us an introduction to the research that her institution has been working on. I think this fits very nicely into the broader perspective that we have here both at APS and Argonne of trying to make the science that we do globally important and paying attention to the ways in which synchrotron radiation and X-ray science touch on environmental issues and our ability to understand living systems. So with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. My first trip to Argonne, and I've had a very busy day exploring all the things that you do here, just getting a little hint on what the capabilities are, and it's truly remarkable. I wanted to tell you a little bit, certainly in my conversations that came up today, when people say the word Woods Hole, they conjure up certain institutions. And there are in reality 6 science institutions in Woods Hole. So some people would say Woods Hole and think of the Marine Biological Lab, which of course is now an affiliate of the University of Chicago, just as Argonne is. Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the Woods Hole Research Center. These are 3 science institutions that are all independent, not-for-profit institutions, except MBL now is, of course, affiliated with the University of Chicago. In addition, there is a USGS branch there that does a lot of work on coastal erosion. And there's the Northeast Fisheries Science Center of NOAA that we do a lot of collaborative work with as well. And finally, the last organization is a small nonprofit organization that offers experiences at sea, semesters at sea to undergraduate students. This is really this is not on a nice cruise ship. Students come out and actually learn how to sail a sailboat, and along the way learn about some astronomy, some ocean science, some climate, some history, maritime history. So just to let you know, I am from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. It's the largest of the institutions. It's year-round. It's a comprehensive organization from its science point of view, engineering point of view, operations, and we do have a joint degree education program with MIT along the way. So that said, what I wanted to chat with you a little bit today is the blue planet and the fact that we are living on a planet that is really governed in many ways by 2 fluids. One happens to be compressible, the other incompressible. One harbors a rich biodiversity of life, the other harbors a lot of interactions with our sun and solar system and plasma fields. But the 2, when you look at them, are really important for driving life and the habitability of this planet. And often when I hear people talk about weather, they think of it as an atmospheric problem only. That's not true. The atmosphere and ocean are very much connected in our weather systems, certainly in our climate systems. And the implications of doing one over the other are pretty severe as we're looking into the future with major changes in what we can expect to see. I'd like to just talk about the fact that we do have one atmosphere and we have one ocean. Many people think we have many oceans. We have one ocean because physically it is connected as one ocean. And if you were to drain all the water off the planet, which is what I'm doing here virtually, you will see that you undercover a solid Earth that harbors some of the tallest mountains on this planet, some of the deepest trenches on this planet. And all of that water that covers 2/3 of the planet's surface, of course, is in a sphere that's less than the size of the moon, or at least an order of dimension smaller. You drain off all of the fresh water, that's the upper small dot there, and then the tiniest is all of the available fresh water. So the point of this is to illustrate the fact that we have a very precious sort of resource here that many people, when they gaze out in the ocean or even in the atmosphere, think it's infinite, it cannot be destroyed, there's plenty of resources out there, nothing's going to change, I can do whatever I want. And in reality, of course, this little here is basically what we have available for us. Now, some of this, which is locked up in ice caps, is coming down into here in the future, but overall, you don't make water. You might be able to take some of this and make some fresh water out of it. Obviously, very energy-intensive processes right now that does that. So let's take a look at these two fluids and why we're calling it a dance, and I'll talk a little bit about this. On the left is basically a NASA model simulation of the ocean currents, of surface currents. On the right is a visualization of cloud cover, that satellite imagery of cloud cover. And when I showed this to a group of venture capitalists, they were, most people, they say, oh, you can see that these two fluids are flowing. Now, obviously sped up the animation of the ocean currents. They're not going that fast. But they are two fluids. You can see clearly sort of the, oops, wrong way, wrong button. I don't know if this will go now. You can basically see sort of the currents along here, and you'll see the cloud cover along in this band, and you see similar patterns, okay? And you see that they can be connected. You can visualize, in fact, that these two are connected in many ways. These motions are transporting and interacting with each other, and in fact, they do. Tremendous reasons for, tremendous purpose here in transporting and circulating heat, momentum, carbon, water, and other chemicals. So I called it a dance because when I talked to this group, they said, oh, there's a dance, there's this movement, there's this motion, and this motion is interacting. And sometimes the atmosphere may lead a dance, and sometimes the ocean may lead the dance, but they have to connect with each other in order to communicate with each other. So let's talk about this as a dance analogy, and it's going to break down at some point, but it's a way in terms of addressing at least what the general public might think is a way of explaining this. And what's obviously setting the stage for this dance is the sun and the planet, and the sunlight heats the Earth, making it warmer near the equator than at the poles, and so that heat obviously has to be redistributed in ways, and that's done primarily through the global wind patterns that materialize on the planet that govern the atmospheric global wind circulation systems, and the global ocean current systems. And together, the cooler temperatures at the poles and the surface winds drive this three-dimensional circulation in the ocean. It's sometimes called the conveyor belt that you see right here. You see along the way here that certain parts of the conveyor belt, the heat is released to the atmosphere. At other parts, the heat is released to the atmosphere, and then a lot of the heat basically here will circulate warmer, the heat imbalance that you have at the equator up into the pole. The atmosphere will do the same thing through its global wind structures as well. And about 50% of the rebalancing of the heat budget will be done by the wind fields, and about 50% will be done by the ocean currents itself. Okay. Now, how do the two communicate with each other? They communicate through this surface boundary. The air-sea interface, it's very important, and it provides the connection. It's going to provide the communication between the two. And really the fundamental reason that the atmosphere matters to the ocean and the ocean to the atmosphere is that they exchange heat, moisture, momentum, nutrients, and biogeochemical properties. And this is the mechanism of what you do. Now, if you look at this is not a flat surface. for communicating with. It's a very complex surface. You certainly have things like wind stress and flux of latent heat and sensible heat. You have temperature communications. You have wave motion. Some of these waves will break. Some of these will bring off spray and bubbles. These are all waves. You have turbulent eddies both at the interface below the ocean, in the ocean, as well as in the atmosphere. And of course, there's communication through the solar radiation and above long wave radiation. And so this is a very, very complex interface to communicate. A lot of communication skills are going on. And a lot of people who work on air-sea interaction are really looking at these different mechanisms and what are the fluxes of this heat, the momentum, and the nutrients that basically express themselves and allow the dance to occur and the planet to move forward with its redistribution. One pattern that clearly emerges, you will have a carbon pattern, but I've just illustrated this with water. One pattern that actually emerges with this atmosphere-ocean communication is the global water cycle. And I think you probably know by now that the ocean is the primary driver of the global water cycle. You have evapotranspiration, land precipitation, clearly human use of groundwater, rivers, and runoff. All of these contribute to a global picture of our water cycle associated with the atmosphere and ocean exchange processes. So one dance is the El Nino. Most of people probably here understand an El Nino signal. And it's one dance here that is illustrated here. This is a normal year in equatorial region where you have a strong Walker circulation with trade winds blowing from east to west. You have a thermal gradient of water in the ocean with a deeper layer of warm water on the west and a shallow layer on the east. And the cold water presses upwards, replacing the warm surface water here along the east. And this is what, of course, provides rich nutrient waters along the coast of South America, giving you a wonderful anchovy harvest along the way. And this is sort of a normal year in a circulation pattern here. In an El Nino here, this circulation really begins to break down. When basically you have this, by the way, I should say over here, in this year, most of the convection you will see is over on the western part of the Pacific Ocean. In an El Nino year, the trade winds drop. You have a circulation here where when the trade winds drop, the warm surface water may flow eastwards. These warm sea currents then replace the cold water that you see over here and establishes a deep layer of warm water along the coast. And you get then the convection materials moving to the center of the Pacific, and that's what you have, the increased convection. So this is sort of a La Nina would be basically reversing back to this, but intensified, okay? So you see this kind of oscillation occurs maybe every 7 to 10 years, sort of sloshing back and forth of the atmosphere and the ocean interfacing with each other to create this. Now, this dance goes on on the planet here. But it's seen around the world. It's not just seen in the equatorial regions. The implications for this dance are felt globally. And in fact, what you can see here is that the many locations that view this dance will see different sort of weather patterns. So in the United States, generally during an El Nino from January to April, you'll have sort of a wet region down here. It'll be dry up in here, and this is the perfect time, and I will go to an El Nino forecast. It's a perfect time to go visit Washington, the state of Washington, okay, because you can get beautiful dry airs. On the other hand, it's a wonderful time to go visit the deserts of Southern California, where you have blooms of cactus that haven't bloomed for 100 years at least in a good El Nino year. You see, obviously, dry conditions emerging over here, wet conditions over the Central Pacific, and you can see sort of this El Nino pattern, even though it may be looking as though the atmosphere and ocean are exchanging most of its properties in the equatorial region. Why shouldn't it just affect the equatorial region? In fact, it has a global response to that picture. Now, so that's just one example of a sort of a balance that we've known about in terms of an atmosphere-ocean oscillation. There are many, many other examples I could give, but I really want to get to the fact of what's changing. And so humans are changing the characters of the dancers of this blue planet. And we're doing it through, obviously, the excess carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere, 9 billion tons of carbon from deforestation. And I don't have the number here, but 40% of that, plus carbon, 46% of that excess carbon will remain in the atmosphere. The land, about 29% of it will be uptake by plants, and the oceans will get about 26% of that excess carbon dioxide when it gets dissolved into seawater. And so the 9 billion tons of carbon per year gets distributed in many ways like this, and you can obviously see that when you start putting this much of carbon back into these systems, that perhaps the dance players are going to change. Okay? So what is the result of all of this? So classic atmospheric carbon dioxide signal from the Mauna Loa Observatory. This is the Keeling curve from the 1960s up until about, I think it was about 2012 there. And you can see, obviously, the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide. But what is the heat content? What's happening to the Earth's total heat content associated with this increase in carbon dioxide? Well, if you add up the heat content in the land and the atmosphere and the ice associated with this excess carbon dioxide, that's this orange curve here. And you can see quite readily that about 90% of the excess heat is actually going into the ocean. So in reality, if we didn't have an ocean right now, okay, our atmosphere would be a lot hotter than what we're looking at right now. It's a buffer. It's been buffering our human activities in the climate zone by basically absorbing the heat associated with the excess carbon dioxide that we put in. Okay, now, I should go back here. I think there were two things that really happened in 2014, two measurements that really made me think, oh my gosh, we have the potential for a runaway climate system. One of them is we've reached 400 parts per million in atmospheric carbon dioxide. You know, when I started working, it was 280 parts per million. It's now up to 400. The second thing that happened was that for the first time, we'd be able to get evidence that the heat and the warming is no longer just penetrating the surface layer of the ocean, but is beginning to penetrate to deeper depths. So there was a lot of controversy in 2014 about the climate hiatus, that the global surface temperature was basically leveling off, and those climate skeptics were basically saying, oh my goodness, they really don't know what they're talking about. There is a climate hiatus, and climate change really isn't going on. But in reality, what's happening here is that, oops, I'm just pushing the wrong buttons here. That the warming of the surface ocean appears to have slowed, but the deeper ocean is now warming. So this shows the total depth is shown in this purple color. The upper is in the black, and the upper 300 and upper 700 meters. And you can begin to see that this heat is basically increasing, and you're getting it to deeper and deeper depths within the ocean. Now, that is a real worrisome factor, because if you think about it, the tremendous heat capacity of the ocean, and as it begins to go to deeper levels within the ocean, really means that now you're talking about a reservoir of heat that's going to be around for millennia, not just hundreds of years, but millennia. And the deeper it goes, the more changes that you're going to have, the more absorption of that ocean, the heat into that ocean means it's going to be around for longer periods of time. Okay. Now, people often will say, okay, well, it's cold. And in 2020, certainly in 2014, there was a lot of talk about the fact that, okay, we have a very cold situation. We have this polar vortex that's coming down. We have this very, very cold along the East Coast. Of course, one forgets that it was very, very warm along the West Coast last year. And part of this polar vortex, or the jet stream, is associated with the land or the ocean and the atmosphere exchange processes and what's happening in terms of the thermal gradients. And so generally, polar air will be constrained in the wintertime to the high latitudes here. And in the case of 2013, you had a circulation system in the atmosphere that was contained quite a bit northward of where it would go. But in 2014, of course, it extended quite a bit southward, and you could see that it was undulating a lot more than what you had here. Okay? These circulation features are associated with a couple of things. First, the polar vortex, or in general, is established by the temperature gradients between the mid-latitudes, if you will, and the Arctic. Okay? Now, in the warming situations that we're seeing right now, the Arctic is actually warming more quickly than the mid-latitudes. So that temperature gradient is weakening over time. And so you basically get sort of a weaker, in a sense, polar vortex, a weaker constraining of the winds into the polar regions. Secondly, you can see here in some years there's not many undulations here, and there's a lot of undulations here. This is basically planetary wave scale waves. These are associated with forcing functions that is heat-driven, again, by major global features. The heat difference between the land and the ocean will create a planetary wave structure. Motions over the major topographic features of the planet will create these wave motions. And if you have a weaker polar vortex in general, the planetary waves will manifest themselves more than if you had a strong polar vortex. Okay? Planetary wave activity tends to be larger in the winter than in the summer months, so that's why you don't see the same situation happening in the summer months. So, although it was very cold this particular year in 2014, about a year ago here, along the east coast of the United States, basically back in a year earlier, it was very, very warm. And in fact, this year, during this period here, because the polar vortex was so symmetric and it was quite a bit northward, we had very, very mild warming, mild conditions. And that warmed the ocean pretty significantly. So that when spring came along, the warming waters were already fairly warm, and they even got warmer. During this particular spring here, there was a lot of a massive migration of certain fish species that, northward that you hadn't seen before, associated with the movement. Particularly the lobster fisheries in Massachusetts moved quite a bit northward. That was a year when the price for lobster was quite low. One could get a good, decent lobster dinner along the way. So with all of this warming situation, the loss of sea ice is probably the most sentinel feature of that warming in the Arctic. It's shown here is just the Arctic sea ice area. But it's important to remember that it's not just the aerial extent of sea ice that's disappearing. It's also the age of the sea ice and the thickness of the sea ice. Okay, and these two features, of course, are causing tremendous warming and accelerated ice sheet loss. I'm going to stop here. The accelerated ice sheet loss has not been able to be captured on current climate models, in part because we haven't understand the dance, if you will, between the atmosphere, the ocean, and the ice itself. Okay? And so over these last few years, or the last decade or so, there's been a really concerted effort to try to look at glaciers from an atmosphere-ocean ice interaction rather than just from a land-based interaction. And most glaciologists are land-based glaciologists. They study glaciers from the land perspective. But by combining and looking from putting new eyes into this and looking at it from an ocean, atmosphere, ice perspective, you can see processes that emerge or dances that emerge here that haven't been modeled before and certainly haven't been put into climate models per se. And so you wouldn't expect then the climate models to actually accurately represent the accelerated sea ice loss. So there are sort of two mechanisms that are going on here. And one is, this is the circulation, the ocean currents. The red is warm, the blue is cold water. And here you have Greenland here. And these warm currents here, under the right conditions, can go up into the fjord systems of the Greenland topography, the fjord systems, which of course bring warm water up into these. Now, these warmer arrows are getting warmer as time goes on here. And what's happening here is that these warm waters actually come in. You have sort of warm surface water, cool, cold waters, and often in a regular sense, in balance, these would be too imbalanced. You would replace enough ice as you lose ice. But what's happening is you're getting these warmer fjord waters coming up and eroding, if you will, the grounding point of the glacier, and so allows the ice to basically slide off more quickly than it would have in the past. So you've disrupted the dance a little bit. You know that dance is no longer in a balance where I create enough ice as much as I lose ice. I'm now not creating enough ice, and I'm losing more ice, basically. So that's one mechanism. The second mechanism that's happening is a dance between the atmosphere and the ice. And in the wintertime, snow basically builds up, and the weight of the snow is on these glaciers, and they slowly sort of migrate down here. But when summer comes, the sunlight comes up, the atmosphere is now warmer, and it starts to melt and form these lakes. When these lakes get to be large enough, they basically crack the ice, and the water just drains along, lubricating, if you will, the bedrock of the ice, the glacier with the bedrock here, down into the water, and then basically just takes all of this water and dumps it into the ocean. Okay? Eventually, there's this crack here. These lakes, which form over the spring and summer, basically, can be quite large in extent. They can take months to form, and once this crack occurs, this can discharge that entire lake into the bottom of the glacier in about a couple hours. So it's very dramatic to see if you're up there. It's this dramatic cracking and a dramatic loss of the water along the way. So these two combinations of a dance between the land, or the glacier, the ice, the ocean, and the atmosphere are basically processes now that have been documented. Experiments have been done. You now have the ability to quantify these, begin to put it into mathematical expressions that could eventually be put into climate models. Okay? Now, why is this so important? Probably one of the most sentinel measurements, the most important measurements that's really needed is to understand this glacial process, because it will be a major contributor to sea level rise. Okay, and this is a map of the sea level rise from 1993 to 2008. The main reason for showing this is to show you that sea level rise is not uniform across the country, across the world. There are places where the sea level rise will be more dramatic, other places where it will be less dramatic. It has been less dramatic. And keep in mind, also, there are places where actually the sea level may decline because the ice, which has been keeping the sort of land surface down, is rebounding, okay, as the land or the permafrost in some of the areas in the north begin to thaw and melt. But sea level rise is probably getting a good idea of the calculation of sea level rise and the implications that it has for coastal cities. A lot of the mega cities in the world, most of the mega cities in the world are located in coastal regions. The implications for infrastructure, the implications for migration of peoples, mass migrations and displacements. Current projections would have, for example, the Maldives completely submerged, and that whole population have to be transported to some other country along the way. So these are some of the issues there. Now, this dance I've just talked about as more of a physical dance. But the dance in the atmosphere and what's happening in the atmosphere and the ocean also plays out in sort of a biogeochemical dance. And as the atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, what this map is basically, these plots are showing you, here's the carbon dioxide increases in the surface ocean and in the atmosphere, and this is in the pH, the resulting pH of the ocean. So effectively what's happening is that as the carbon dioxide, the excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that makes it into the ocean, it gets dissolved in the ocean, the carbon dioxide gets dissolved through simple basic chemistry equations that cannot be doubted. You have basically carbonate that is basically increased and so results in basically a pH that declines, okay? This is what we call in terms of ocean acidification. It basically Doesn't mean that the ocean is going to become an acid, but it does mean that the pH of the ocean is decreasing. And there are certain, and it's decreasing rapidly, okay? And this is where the ocean has a lot more of a responsibility, if you will, than the atmosphere because of the life it harbors. Okay, the biodiversity of life that's in there, the tremendous life that we enjoy, the services that we enjoy from that biological diversity. And so any shell-producing organism, coral reef systems are basically worried or are going to be stressed by a lower pH. Certain coral reef systems will be more resilient to this than others. But again, what's happening is that it's happening in such a short time scales that the ability for life systems to actually adapt to changes and evolve to these changes is what's at risk here. Okay. What that means, of course, is changes to both at the micro level. This is basically a single-celled organism, part of the food chain that produces a shell to complete coral reef systems. And there's now demonstrated work that's being done in coral reef systems and in on shell-producing animals to determine what the consequences might be, and to identify which of these species might be a little bit more resistant to these rapid changes, and if so, are resilient to these rapid changes, and if so, how can you nurture them along or protect them in ways that would perhaps allow them to have a better chance of survival in some of these environments. So, but what's the interesting thing about these changes? It's not so much this one thing or that one thing or that one thing. It's what happens when they come together in a real feedback loop system. And so the one scenario that is, and this is just one of these nonlinear feedback systems that oceanographers are quite worried about, is the triple threat, which is unexpected consequences. And I'll step through it. You have basically global warming associated with the enhanced carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, I should say, at the surface of the ocean. The surface of the ocean is absorbing some of that excess heat. And because of that excess heat, you get a warmer layer that reduces the mixing within the ocean interior. Okay? So there's lots of mixing, if you will, of nutrients and everything that go through this sort of surface layer of the ocean. And just think of it as putting sort of a cap or a lid on some of that. Well, it's not quite a lid, but full there. So what happens there is because that reduces the mixing, then this interior column of the ocean, where the mixing would mix oxygen down into the deeper levels of the ocean in normal circumstances, is not there. Okay? So why is that important? Marine mammals that require oxygen from the ocean are now basically deprived of habitat or areas where they can go because these minimum oxygen zones are have basically expanded. Okay? So what you have here, the surface ocean, the heating reduces the mixing, and these minimum zones basically expand in depth. Now, you combine that with what's happening on the coast. So what you have in the coast, another threat to the ocean is the tremendous nutrient runoff and atmospheric deposition that feeds phytoplankton pollutants. So all the pollution, whether it's nitrogen fertilizers, other sorts of other pollutions that come off our agricultural lands into our river streams and down into the ocean, basically produce nutrient runoff situations. And there's any number of pollutants that contribute to this. So they feed these phytoplankton blooms. So you will see these phytoplankton blooms, many of which you can see from space, from spacecraft. They're quite extensive. The microbes decompose the plankton, depleting oxygen in the water. Okay, so you've got two things going on. You've got things going on sort of in a long-term state associated with global warming, and then you have coastal issues going along with associated with depleting oxygen in the water in the coastal region associated with pollution activities. You combine this together, and what happens is as these expanding oxygen minimum zones up here shoal up onto the continental slope, adding to the low oxygen waters here, you even further enhance low oxygen zones. So the ocean is experiencing a lot more low oxygen zones in its coastal regions than in the past. Okay? And this just illustrates, again, how this dance between the atmosphere, the ocean, and now life get played out. This is a very, very complicated diet. Well, it's not complicated. It's not that complicated, but it illustrates all of the processes that you have to think about in this dance in terms of nutrient exchange, the shelf break. This is along the continental shelf. The continental shelf, at least on the East Coast, is quite a dramatic drop-off across the continental slope. It happens to be the area of some of the most rich biological productivity in the ocean. But understanding this atmosphere, ocean interface up here, what's happening in terms of our weather and climate, which forces a lot of these shelf break processes, both at mesoscale and submesoscale, and then what happens to the ecosystem. This is all of the things that we're trying to figure out when this atmosphere-ocean exchange. So what is the shelf break life lookup? This is basically an autonomous underwater vehicle, Remus, that was designed and built and now manufactured by Hydroid. And basically, what this is taking a look at what's the life on the shelf there off of the East Coast. And what was made? This is looking at a camera that's looking. This is a camera. Start again. There's the Remus autonomous underwater vehicle. Where it's being deployed along the continental shelf here. You have, this is the deployment phase going into the water. And then now have a camera that's looking back to the back end of the autonomous underwater vehicle. And all of a sudden you have a complete shoaling or schooling of fish following this vehicle. Now why? Why is this doing this? It's kind of an interesting sort of look at behavior. Close-up look at the shelf is also looking at some of the microbial features that you see here. And you can basically also get an idea of what the food chain is looking like as well. Okay, so let's get to the next part of this presentation. And that is, what's the choreography of the dance? In order to do the choreography of the dance, you have to have observations. You have to know what the partners are doing. You have to know what their moves are. Okay? You have to be able to have eyes, if you will, to observe what these dancers are doing. In the atmosphere, this is a graph of all of the hourly and sub-hourly atmospheric observation stations around the world. This is augmented by satellite data. It's augmented by airplane data. It's augmented by other data that one can see. So you can see that you have a fairly, at least land-based, observing system for the atmosphere that is basically your eyes on what the atmosphere is doing, how it's moving along. This is fed, of course, into a world data center. The WMO coordinates these world observations. They are available. They go into your weather forecasting models that you get that we get every day. You can see that there's certainly some atmospheric observations over from the ground at this time scale over ocean areas. Those are primarily coming from buoys. So most buoys that go into the ocean have both atmospheric sensors as well as oceanographic sensors. But you also see that the density is pretty good, considering what I'm going to show you next, which is what we have in the ocean. Okay, so the ocean equivalent backbone is the Argo program, the Argo sensor. These are Argo floats. They are easily to deploy. You can throw them easily into the ocean. They go down about 2,000 meters in terms of a profile that goes up and down along a wire, and it will measure your standard oceanographic variables of temperature, current, salinity. They're obviously much more sparse than what you saw on the atmospheric side. And also keep in mind, though, satellites are not going to penetrate the ocean. Satellites will only give you a measure of the surface, what's happening on the surface. Okay? What's assumed is that the surface expression is an expression of what's happening below. But that's doesn't give you enough details in order to be able to describe the stance. So as of September 2014, there were 3,628 of these floats, and this was an image of where they are. And they float around the currents, and this is, again, distributed worldwide. It actually goes into weather forecasting or into forecast offices as well. There's obviously a major dearth of observations in the areas where change is happening quite rapidly up in the Arctic. And of course, there's not much in the southern ocean regions as well. I'm talking about how we're now changing some of these observing eyes, if you will, on these dancers. And the Argo float system currently measures depth, temperature, and salinity. It goes down to about 2,000 meters, as you say. Here's the wire. It has about 1 hour at surface. It records the temperature and salinity as it rises, and it drifts basically for about 10 days before it comes back up and goes back down again. There are, in the plans, deep Argo floats that will measure down to 6,000 meters of depth. This is really, really important given the fact that for the first time we're beginning to see that heating going down and deep into the ocean. We really want to get deeper down into the ocean. So these deep Argo floats, if funding should arise, are basically available and are ready to be able to go. And many of the Argo systems some of them are being replaced with these deep Argo floats. What's more interesting in many ways is the new innovation or new technology development of incorporating biological sensors and not just physical sensors on these Argo floats that will measure variables such as dissolved oxygen, dissolved organic matter, nitrate, chlorophyll, particle scattering. And these are just in the testing stage right now, and something that would really begin to enhance our understanding of the dance between what's happening in the ocean and its biological response. The other thing is what to do in the Arctic, and indeed under ice. And so there's been, again, development of an ice-tethered profiler that will be able to take, that takes measurements, again, along a wire here. Basically, it's a buoy, this yellow buoy here that's embedded in the ice. You have a profiler that goes up and down. Like I said, here's, sorry. Okay. Here is basically the system here. It goes basically up and down, and then this whole ice tether profiler just flows with as the ice moves. So, with GPS coordinates, you can track basically where it's moving, so you have an idea where this sensor is going. It communicates its data back up through a satellite. And here's just an example of the motion of these ice tether profilers around in the Arctic region over a given time period. They're disposable. You don't pick them up, you lose them, and they're relatively inexpensive when you talk about in terms of oceanographic instrumentation. So this has given some sort of opportunity to take a look at getting some physical measurements underneath the ice to determine what's happening up in these regions. There are a lot of other frontiers of knowledge in the ocean where the technology is basically ready and has been underdeveloped. A lot of it is ready to be deployed, certainly working under ice with autonomous under vehicles, not just to get the vertical dimension, but to be able to move horizontally underneath the ice, the climate dimension, the deep zones of basically the trenches, if you will, which house a diversity of life that we know that we are just beginning to explore. The mid-water columns where there's an inverted pyramid of biomass, and the marine microbial area, which is also pretty critical. And this last area, these biology areas, are where there's been tremendous advances in thinking and developing technologies. But let me first just talk about exploring under the ice using a vehicle that allows you to get horizontal movement and be able to take measurements or take looks horizontally. And this is the Nereid under ice vehicle that was just developed at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. This is video from its first test drive that was just happened this last year. And what you're seeing here is views of the water column, not just vertically, but horizontally. And because there are cameras both looking downward as well as upward, you could see this microbial life just hanging on the underside of the ice. The biologist that was on this particular cruise, this expedition, basically said they had no idea that there was that much microbial life living underneath the ice in the Arctic region. So now this is visualization. This is just taking a look at visualizing and a lot of oceanography takes advantage of imaging. But there are other ways that one has made progress in looking at the biology of what's going on. And if you look at the bottom of the food chain, plankton, and plankton is a catch-all term for microbes and bacteria and single-celled organisms and simple organisms. Plankton, they're the bottom of the food chain. And this is the many faces of plankton. This is, images of various plankton. And, what you'd like to know as a biologist is which species are present, what are they doing, how is the ecosystem changing over time. Using a new technique, or a new instrument that's built by scientist Heidi Sosik called an imaging flow cytobot, which is really an automated underwater microscope. And it uses a system that combines video and flow cytometric technology to capture both images of plankton in the water column for identification, and also measures then the chlorophyll fluorescence associated with that image. The images are then automatically classified in the system. The chlorophyll is basically used to help identify the characteristics, and it has a huge database, as you can imagine. In oceanography, the issue of big data is prominent, particularly in looking at imagery such as this. But the large volume of imagery has required us to look at a solution that allows automatic analysis and identification. The installation on Martha's Vineyard, which is where Heidi's done a lot of her initial work here, she's now collected over 500 million images. The last story I'd like to tell is by working with this domain scientist working with an information computational scientist, we've been able to find a solution to her imagery problem. And I know that it was a success when she told me that, when I asked her, what has this project meant to you? She said, I can do in 6 hours what would have taken me 6 years to do. So that's the power of what you can do for this sort of thing. This is an environmental sample processor. This is another new biological sensor. It's basically a genetics can in a lab, a genetics lab in a can. You submerge it in the ocean. You basically are using it for looking at genomic markers of species in the water, and particularly for looking at them in terms of harmful algal bloom identification and toxicity that might occur. So you take the water, it gets filtered, you do the lysec, you do the chemistry in order to release the DNA and RNA. You add a sample to and process the probe, and then eventually the probe will get compared with a standardized puck that has the known genetic structures of the toxins that you're trying to determine. So this is now getting used. This is the image array that one comes back that identifies and then ships back to shore if there's a particular toxin in place. So this is also revolutionizing then our ability to really do some major genomic studies. And in fact, this combined with biological modeling of harmful algal blooms, which I think I'm going to have to just show here. This is the model of taking looking at the biological life cycle of a particular cyst, how it interfaces with its atmosphere and ocean environment, and how the bloom basically matures, writing the mathematical model for it, creating then a model that could capture what this bloom particularly would look like. And this work is now being used in an experimental operational mode with NOAA to identify harmful algal bloom outbreaks along the northeast as well. So basically, what we have in the ocean is a situation where you have a lot of scales of motion that operating a lot of temporal scales, and you've got tools or platforms that need to basically put those eyes to observe the dance, what's happening here. So observatories and moorings might cover these sort of spatial and time scales, drifters and floats, satellite observations, long-range autonomous underwater vehicles, and sort of shorter-range autonomous underwater vehicles. And I thought I'd share with you just a little bit about what our thinking is in the institution about using the advances in sort of robotics in making autonomous underwater vehicles actually do more than what they have in the past. So this is sort of a diagram of some of our thinking, of sort of a phased approach to autonomous exploration of the ocean. And what you have here is basically an AUV that could be working at tens of kilometers spacing here. You have a ship that's sort of launched this autonomous underwater vehicle, as well as an autonomous surface vehicle. And that autonomous surface vehicle is providing, in a sense, the communication and for this particular AUV that's doing some work down in the ocean here, doing some sampling and measurements. And it might be doing this for 1 or 2 days. The ship can go off for 1 or 2 days, do something other work that it's doing, and then come back. The AUSV, autonomous surface vehicle, can communicate with the ship and get back. So that's sort of phase 1 in terms of AUV operations or autonomous exploration. Phase 2 would just shown here, sort of a ridge survey that might be hundreds of kilometers in spatial dimension. And in this case, you have an autonomous surface vehicle that is basically replacing the ship altogether. Okay, and you're doing the communication. It's launched the AUV. It's doing all the communication, and it communicates back to shore the data that it gets. Phase 3, which is totally on a paper design, blue sky phase, would be where you have basin scale surveys looking at thousands of kilometers of surveys. And in here, you basically have pure autonomy here. There's a change, if you will, in the surface vessel itself. The autonomous surface vessel has become a lot more powerful. It can communicate more easily through perhaps an optical modem, which has been developed along the way in this work. So typically, when you are looking at autonomy in the ocean, people think about as decision-making as sort of a key intellectual thing. How do the humans and machines interface? What will the robot do? What do you want it to do? But the ability for a human to basically communicate objectives in a simple way in the ocean is essential for these functional systems. And they require some very highly flexible software systems that are out there now that will carry out very complex missions. But they're still just pretty difficult to configure. And indeed, a lot of operator error is pretty rampant it's a significant issue in autonomous underwater vehicle operations. So this sort of issue of having sensors and perception, how does the robot sense and understand the environment? The key that's got to be new and worked on is a decision-making software that allows the robot to make a decision, okay? And make that decision in real time, and progressive levels of sophistication that will occur in that decision-making ability. So one of the biggest problems in doing autonomous work and surveying in the ocean is communication. The only way you can really, in the past, communicate with vehicles over large distances through acoustics, and acoustics bandwidth is obviously very, very, very low. We've just developed an optical modem. What you're seeing here is video in real time that was transmitted through an optical modem. So we've gotten to the point with an optical modem in the ocean with the right sort of range that you can basically couple with acoustic communication in order to get some very high bandwidth that can basically solve your data problem and your communication problem that allows sort of more rapid decision-making to occur. That allows the opportunity to think about instilling a robot with curiosity. Right now, our robots in the ocean are programmed. They're programmed to mow the lawn. You throw an AUV. If you're doing a new survey, you just mow the lawn, okay? This is basically how we found Air France 447, the airplane that crashed. You just mowed the lawn, you mowed the lawn, you mowed the lawn, and oh, it looks like there's something that's over there, okay? Now then go down and put cameras down, and you can find things. So, but the real question is, in real human exploration of anything, you are looking and you're looking and you're looking, and all of a sudden you say, I see something interesting there. I want to go over there. This stuff doesn't look that interesting. You want eventually the robot to have enough environmental awareness and decision-making capabilities that it could make that decision to get away from its mowing and go on and explore something that might be interesting. Which leads to, in general, to the next generation of co-robotic systems. And now we're talking about systems that put all these platforms together, all these sensors together in ways that can run autonomously and give you continuous data. And this is just a sort of a schematic that illustrates the numbers of platforms that are tethered. Some are tethered, some are autonomous. Some have sensors. These are profilers here. And these are gliders with docking stations. So you see all sorts of opportunities here to begin to put these robotic systems together and collect images, collect sensor data, and combine human intelligence in ways that we haven't done before. One of the most interesting projects that I've been working on over the last 7 years has been the Ocean Observatories Initiative, which is a $300 million initiative sponsored by the National Science Foundation to put one of these observing systems in place in 6 locations, 2 in the Northern Sea, one at Papa, one at Erminger, one at Argentine Basin, Southern Ocean, and then 2 coastal arrays, one off the New England coast and one off the Juan de Fuca Plate, using, again, these profilers, gliders, autonomous underwater vehicles. This is being deployed right now. Data is now coming back. And it will, for the first time, give oceanographers 24-hour-a-day information, 7 days a week, 360 days a year, something the atmospheric scientists have long had. And that should really change the way you do it. The other thing that's happening is this real interest in the Arctic and its influence on the North Atlantic. If you look at the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, you see up in the Arctic regions a very, very complex circulations. This has not been measured. Okay, it has not been measured. There's been a tropical or a subtropical array across the Atlantic basin down here. So for the first time, this program here, again funded by NSF's taking the lead, and international collaborators is beginning to take a good transatlantic look across this very important circulation feature. With the freshening of the Arctic water into the North Atlantic, there's some expectations that what might happen with the Gulf Stream circulation, and of course, which would play out with the atmosphere in terms of changes in weather along the way. And finally, on an ecosystem scale, observatories that are being made on a much smaller scale to look at nutrient fluxes, ecosystem fluxes in areas that have a lot of biological productivity to get to the point where you're not just looking at a single species, but you're looking at a whole ecosystem and the ability to model that. Why? Why? Who cares? Okay? And in reality, there are many countries right now looking at the ocean as their new economy. The Europeans are looking at this. The Asians are looking at this. The United States doesn't so much use the term blue economy, but you know that there's elements along with this. And all of this science, all of this information leads to an economy that certainly has a technology component. It has a biotech and bioprospecting component. We just had a scientist look at an algae, and they were able to produce 2 fuels from that. Fisheries and aquaculture information, ocean energy and resources, another area. Informatics, any business that is climate or weather sensitive should be interested in ocean information. And of course, the ability to manage and assess the health of marine protected areas. The hazards, I'll end with the hazards of working in the ocean. This is a REMIS vehicle. We had this going out in the ocean one day, collecting, doing some shark tagging. Actually, we wanted to look at sharks and how they worked in their habitat. And there are some hazards along the way that one works in the ocean that one often doesn't have on land, or at least that can't see. So with that, I'll end, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
One thing I'll say, for those of you who are beamline scientists in the audience, you're feeling a lot better about your users right now. So I thank you for that wonderful introduction. So let me take the chairman's prerogative and ask the first question.
Sure.
So what is the one thing you don't know right now that you most want to know?
Oh, the one thing we know, oh boy, that's a hard question. There's so many things that we would want to know. I think I think we would want to know how the basic circulation system is changing. Okay? All right? I think that's one of the things that we really would like to know. This last year, in November, or in 2014, all the conditions were ripe for an El Nino to happen. We talked about it in the newspaper. There were lots of talks about an El Nino year is coming, El Nino's going to here. It did not materialize. Why? Okay, and there's about 5 hypotheses out there right now of an atmosphere-ocean exchange problem. Why? So some of these normal patterns that we've expected before are not happening anymore. Why? So those are some of the things. I would say the other thing is the life system, okay. The life system that we have in the ocean. That is probably one of the most precious things that we have on this planet. Yeah.
Questions? Paul.
Methane hydrates.
Yes.
What do we know, what don't we know? Are those going to bite us?
Some people are mining them. Japan has done some mining of the deep sea methane hydrates for energy. Methane is certainly a big greenhouse gas. A lot of the methane hydrates are basically under pressure. They're in the deep ocean. They're under pressure, cold temperatures. And, the pressure's not going to change, okay? But methane hydrates associated with permafrost, the release of methane associated with permafrost melting is something we should be concerned about. Yeah. Yeah. I've talked to my geologists about this, and they're kind of skeptical. They would say, on a cautionary note right now, from a scientist's point of view, they would be worried about what's happening in the permafrost area. But all of that methane that is basically in the calthrates associated in the deep sediments of the ocean, they're embedded in that because of 2 things. You have to have the cold temperatures, and you have to have the pressure. Okay. Now, if it were to be released, it most likely would not, according to them, most likely would not get to the atmosphere. It would just get dissolved within the ocean itself. So it might have consequences, dramatic consequences in the ocean. I don't know what would happen, but it wouldn't necessarily make it up into the atmosphere. It would just go into a gaseous form and get dissolved in the ocean.
Yeah.
How are your observation locations and one of the last slides you showed? How are those sites selected?
Yeah, they were selected primarily by science drivers. And there was a scientific workshop that was held on what you could do with sort of more continuous observation and sort of what were some of the key outstanding questions. So on the Pioneer Array, the coastal array off of New England there, that's basically just south of Georges Bank. Georges Bank, again, is high biological activity, and it's also it's a nested grid. It's got a high resolution and then a little larger horizontal resolution, and then a larger, and then sort of a nested grid of observations that cover the shelf and the shelf break. And that is from a biological and physical point of view, it's such a dynamic region in the ocean that we know nothing about. And so that's why that reason was chosen. The coastal array on the left, on the west coast, is on the Juan de Fuca Plate. It's one of the most instrumented and obviously earthquake-prone zones. It's a Cascadia fault, and lots of information that's kind of needed. It's been an easy place to really get to a plate tectonic area to study the geology that's happened. The to northern Papa has been a long-term observing site in the Pacific that just needed, that has anchored some climate models, but needed more continuous operation and data. The Erminger Sea was very interesting because if you look at climate models, any climate model that you look at that makes projections of sea surface or surface temperature up to 2050, you will see that it's mostly red. Okay, the temperatures increase, except over the Erminger Sea. The Erminger Sea is that area where there's deep return circulation of through cold water deep down into the ocean, and that's where that OSNAP program was really pointing. The two southern ones, actually the Argentine was just added at the last minute. The Southern Ocean is, in part, the Southern Ocean is believed to be one of the largest areas of uptake of carbon dioxide, that as well as the Atlantic. And we have very few observations in the Southern Ocean, absolutely very little. So that was sort of to anchor what might be an international observing array in the Southern Ocean. The Argentine Basin, in a sense, is also a very critical point, and from a climate perspective and a biological perspective as well, sort of a counterpoint to the Pioneer Array in terms of the biology and the physics that is down there. So a workshop was held. These big scientific questions were said. What could we do if we had continuous operations? These arrays of the OOI are supposed to last for 25 years. So we're talking about a long-term observing, a major investment, if you will, in ocean observing for some key areas. So that's how it was decided.
All right, any last questions? Yeah, back here.
So in one of your videos, there was a school of fish following the autonomic vehicle.
Yeah.
Why did that happen? And if we see this, something changes by the measurements, can you draw any conclusions about how your observations are actually affecting the ocean?
Yeah. So the answer is they were actually very surprised by the schooling of fish behind the vehicle. The vehicle was put in. Again, this is one of these. This is again off that continental shelf. Lots of biological activity in general, but you wouldn't see it like this. But for some reason, they really loved that autonomous underwater vehicle, and they just came to it. So why? Those are the things we just don't know. Yeah, just don't know. Don't know. So they will be working on that. They'll be answering, trying to. It could be their currents. It could be some heat that was being let off. It could be, it could be curiosity for all I know. But I think it probably is some motion in the ocean that emulated something that the fish thought might be interesting, food-wise, probably.
Jonathan.
In the area, especially of autonomous vehicles, I wonder to the extent to which you're either collaborating or competing with, like, the U.S. Navy.
Well, first of all, one has to appreciate in oceanography that the Navy has been probably the single most great investment in oceanography observing systems. And certainly AUVs and the history of AUVs, the development of AUVs have been really supported by the Navy all along. The NSF is taking advantage of it right now. But the Navy investment in ocean obs has been huge since World War II. We work with the Navy. We obviously get funding from the Navy, and they see a lot of the potential. Obviously, they get nervous when we get too excited about working with places like China and other places. But for the most part, I think they've been very supportive of a lot of this work. We collaborate with them. We almost think of it as a partnership that we have with the Navy. We used to be block funded by the Navy. I wish that was still the case. In World War II, the Navy really block funded both Woods Hole Oceanographic as well as Scripps. Those were some of the glory days of funding. Now it's like mini NSF in a way. But there have been long-term programs of technology development funded by the Navy, and they've been a great supporter. We have formed a new Center for Marine Robotics. That's our new effort to really look at some of these co-robotic challenges. And we're partnering with academic institutions that have had robotics experience, not in the marine environment, but in things like manufacturing, biomedical applications, things like that, so we can learn from them. And we've been working closely with the aerospace department at MIT in environmental awareness, the ability to sense, and they're working on the autonomous car. What can we learn from that environmental awareness, the sensing, and the real-time decision-making that has to be made? So I think the next generation of co-robotics, we really see the robotics field blossoming in many ways with so many applications. It's fairly easy to make a robot go in a swimming pool. It's not as easy to make it really work in the ocean. So that's part of that. And that real-time decision-making to make that curious robot and that robot that will sense environmental awareness and be able to make its decisions on its own instead of just programming it to do so. That's sort of the vision and the dream.
So one last question.
There are people who do atmospheric modeling on a grand scale. Thank you. There are people who do atmospheric modeling on a grand scale. I assume you probably know quite a lot about that.
Yeah.
The inputs come from the ocean and various other things. The calculations are such that a person who isn't doing those calculations really can't see through them very well. My question is, given the state of information that you know about the oceans especially, but also the atmosphere, should we now be believing that those predictions are really very accurate?
Well, I think I understand your question. It's true that, modeling of the atmosphere, if you're really going to do a model right of the atmosphere, particularly of a climate model of the atmosphere, the climate is more than the atmosphere. It has to have the ocean in there. And there's been more and more sophisticated ocean modeling, okay, that has developed over the years by many, many groups that have incorporated some of these new processes that we're seeing, and obviously more vertical and horizontal resolution. Those then get incorporated at places like the National Center for Atmospheric Research or Los Alamos, or probably here for that matter, Oak Ridge, that basically incorporate more and more sophisticated ocean models. I always, do I believe the models? I certainly believe them enough to know that climate change is happening, and that we have some, but the models will have to improve, particularly if you're going to take it down to a regional scale and looking at regional climate projections. So,
as you know, the Council of the American Physical Society has endorsed those and drawn very strong conclusions. And my question is really, well, do you personally think those conclusions can be justified at the present time?
Yeah, I believe strongly in the IPCC and the conclusions that have been derived from the IPCC. I think they're significant. I think that you can argue with uncertainty levels and some of the things, but the basic fundamental premise that we have a changing climate that's basically human-induced is validated by the evidence. And it's not just the model itself, it's the data as well. And people, I have been on many panels with skeptics, and what happens is that they tend to cherry pick part of a temperature record, and they will take, and they'll only look at an atmospheric signal. And I think when you start looking at the climate problem, you have to think about it not just as a global temperature increase or a global temperature measurement. You have to think about it in terms of the things that you're seeing regionally, the things that you're seeing in terms of storms and the probability of extreme weather. You have to look at it in terms of the ocean acidification. I can talk about climate change more easily with a public person when I talk to them about what's happening to coral reef systems. Because they can see that, okay? It's putting, if you will, a climate system that is an atmosphere, ocean, land scenario, and you lighting all the evidence up in migration patterns, fishery habitat changes that cannot be explained in terms of probability arguments any other way. People will argue it's the sun. I said you can put the sun, the solar forcing in these models, and you can take the solar forcing out. The sun is certainly important to put in these climate models and the variations of the solar output, but it does not explain the rapid changes that we're seeing over a short period of time. So I believe it, yeah. I would take action.
So I think we could go on for a long time after this, but just out of consideration for our speaker, let's thank her again, and really fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.